Check out this clip.
Oh, thank God. Okay, now I can play the game.
So he just started playing the game.
Okay. Okay, let me turn this down. Okay, let's see here. Motion blur off.
Motion blur, the first setting to be turned off. I feel like this is the embodiment of PC gaming. How fast can you put an FPS counter in the top left corner of the screen, and then how fast can you turn off motion blur? Because that is the advantage of being on PC. The fact that we can track our performance, the fact that we can turn off settings that arguably can make the game look worse. But my opinion on motion blur started to change when I saw this.
More importantly, Bethesda worked with the fine folks at id Software to implement a new per-pixel motion blur. Given that it's a 30 frames per second experience on Xbox, it's critical too, as it greatly improves the perception of fluidity even at this lower frame rate target.
What if it actually looks good? I mean, every game pretty much defaults to putting motion blur on in it. Why do we always turn it off? What the hell? It literally spawned in and it like fell out the sky. So this is motion blur. It's kind of in the name. Whenever you move or anything, then you get blurring effects going on. Now, this is pretty realistic when it comes down to it. When you pan a camera around, it's the same story. However, what's interesting about a camera is you can actually turn up the shutter speed. And what this does is eliminate motion blur. And that's what can make smartphone video when it's bright and sunny outside look a little weird and unnatural. You can get a similar effect to turning up shutter speed on a camera by turning off motion blur in a game, because all of a sudden you can see every individual frame. They don't slur together. Things can look a little bit more clear, a little bit more sharp. And this has its benefits and its downsides, obviously. And that's why I've got 3 reasons why motion blur is actually a very powerful feature, but another few reasons why it can be very detrimental for gaming and actually the future of gaming. Now, first, I think it's most obvious. Just walking around, I think it feels a lot more lifelike, because when you turn your head quickly in real life, you don't see everything or make out all the details. Yes, this is adding a level of realism to a game that many would argue doesn't need to be in the game. Like, we don't need games to be realistic. And I think that's a completely fair point, but I can feel more immersion when it feels more like I'm actually looking around the frame. Now, the next advantage to it is actually if we go into here and we go to video, set the maximum FPS, and we set it all the way down to 30. So let's see the effect of playing at 30 FPS. When you turn off motion blur and you're playing at a low FPS, I know this is an extreme example, will allow us to smooth out the game a lot more. And I'm just saying, yes, it kind of looks slurry, like a slurry mess. It's either you play at 30 FPS and it looks super choppy, or you play with motion blur and it looks a lot more smooth. I don't know what the heck is going on, and like everything got dark all of a sudden, and I'm a little spooked. Okay. Now, the last main advantage can be a little bit controversial. There is some upsides and downsides to it. Let's go ahead and uncap our FPS. Motion blur actually goes to hide some of the things that game developers are using to render games now. Okay, so let's turn on the RT Overdrive preset to actually test this out. I know this is an extreme example. However, we also have another feature in this game that's called DLSS Ray Reconstruction. This is important to note because I have a little history on the channel where I reviewed this feature of ray reconstruction. Everybody, all the reviewers were saying it's amazing and everything. I was the only one that was like, hey, ray reconstruction has a very fatal issue. Now, to notice this, we're gonna go ahead and turn off motion blur. That's important to take into account. Now, in order to demonstrate this, let's go ahead and follow another car. You can see with this one here, there is a distracting amount of this weird ghosting thing behind this car in front of me. Now, it's a little bit hard to drive at like 20 FPS, and this is an extreme example. Ray reconstruction here obviously has issues in motion where this car in front of me is kind of like leaving this ghosted trail behind it. I concluded in my video that ray reconstruction, this aspect of it was so distracting that it was pretty much unusable at this current moment. With motion blur off, I was able to notice this, and ray tracing in general has a lot of issues in motion. But we can also see that it's not just ray tracing that has issues in motion. If we were to use upscaling, for example, the performance mode on many of these has issues in motion. If you've seen Starfield here, there's a lot of ghosting and things like that, because if you move the camera too quickly, then it's going to temporally leave older frames behind, and this will leave a faint trail of something. frame generation with FSR 3.0 or DLSS 3.0 also has issues in motion. The faster you move around with all of these technologies, it breaks down in motion. No matter what, it happens with everything. But a lot of these techniques to render games nowadays are temporal. And that means it takes into account previous frames or even the next frame in the sequence in order to try to make up the difference and use information that we already know in order to make the new frame. And what that can cause is when you're in motion within a game, there's a lot of difference between the frames. It can't always get it perfect. And with that, we can use motion blur to hide some of the artifacts that come up when rendering modern games. And this can be seen as a positive or a negative. Well, if things are moving this direction, then turning on motion blur might help to just have on all the time to hide the issues that are actually going on with gaming. But motion blur could also be seen as a crutch that is hiding the flaws of games. And that's exactly why if you see me comparing DLSS frame generation or FSR frame generation, upscaling from DLSS or FSR, or if I'm talking about ray reconstruction, you're never going to see me using motion blur. And that's because it hides the flaws of these technologies. I want to look at these completely objectively based on their image quality. But a part of me is just like, well, motion blur already looks at least more natural in my eyes. It helps at lower FPS, and it can help hide some of the artifacts and flaws that we can see in games. To me, that's a lot of advantages with motion blur. Although there's another negative, a major one, and motion blur is on right now. So when we're whipping around the camera, it's pretty hard to see things. So if you wanted to aim at something and you're trying to aim, you're like, oh, I'm trying to make this out and I just can't quite, I can't lock on this. I know I'm not in a combat situation here. Whereas if you turn off motion blur, you can kind of make out characters and act quickly on your reflexes when you can see every individual frame. It gives you a competitive advantage. That's why I don't think that motion blur has a place in competitive games. For me, I like that it does feel natural. I like that I feel immersed into a game. It looks like when I pan around that it looks realistic, and naturally, I wouldn't be able to pick out somebody who's shooting me away when I'm turning and spinning around and stuff like that. That isn't natural in real life either. Games don't have to be real life, but I like the immersion of motion blur. So yeah, that's motion blur, the most hated setting in PC gaming that most of us turn off immediately when we start up a game. It's kind of like a prerequisite when it comes down to it. But in a lot of ways, I've personally grown to love it. And I wonder if I've convinced some of you guys to start turning on motion blur and not instinctually turning it off like I used to. But again, I completely understand the other side where you want to see every single thing in every single frame, and games don't need to look like real life or feel natural. I understand that perspective. Even if you don't agree with me, I hope you enjoyed this video and you're able to take something out of it. And if you disagree, if there's more points I didn't hit on with motion blur, go ahead and comment them below. And, go ahead and check out this video where I talked about FSR 3 frame generation, but I didn't turn on motion blur because it hides some of the flaws that it has. Okay, that's been it for me. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. I'll see y'all in the next video, and peace.